Hello everybody and welcome back to another video. It is finally time. The Overwatch League kicks off once again this week. It has been such a long off season. We are finally here for the 2022 season. Season 5 is tomorrow. 3 p.m. Eastern is the first match of the weekend. And so it's time to do the picks. If you're new around here, the way this works is I'm just going to go through each of the matches, give you my thoughts on them. Each week I pick 2 games to be big pick games. Essentially, they are my games of the weekend. I think they're going to be the best games of the weekend, and so I highlight those. Usually, they're the games I think are going to be the most competitive, as well as some of the best of the weekend. And those are the games that I highlight. And I keep track every week of my overall pick record and my big pick record, kind of separately, to see if I do better picking those bigger games or not. So you'll see that as we go on. That is kind of the way the system works. But let's jump in. Let's talk about the first match of the weekend. May 5th, 3 p.m. Eastern, we have the LA Gladiators taking on the New York Excelsior. Now, the NYXL roster, when we first saw them announced, they looked to be pretty promising. They looked like a roster that just had a couple pieces they needed to fill in, and they would be a really strong, really top-level roster. And those pieces never really got full. Or got filled. They did add Vulcan to the roster, but he's an American player on a roster where everybody else is Korean. It was a bizarre addition, kind of an odd addition, and so this NYXL roster is one that has some potential, has some strong pieces, but definitely one that you have a lot of questions surrounding. And they're finding themselves up against a juggernaut in the Gladiators, who look to be one of the best teams in the league in general, not even just the Western region. I had them at number 1 in my Western Region Power Rankings, so you know how I feel about them. I feel very confident in this team and its ability to do well. So I am going to pick the Gladiators to win this one, and I'm going to pick it to be a 3-1 scoreline for the Gladiators in this one. I'll give the NYXL a map because I am a fan of them, but ultimately I think this is going to be a pretty one-sided affair in favor of the LA Gladiators. Second match of the day is the Paris Eternal taking on the San Francisco Shock. 2 teams that are pretty minimal in their roster construction. Shock don't have a main support or a main tank player. Eternal only have the 2 DPS players. They don't have a second flex support player. So really this one comes down purely to the talent on this roster. This isn't really something that I feel will come down to anything else. Both teams will have a composition that works for them, that they enjoy, that they like. And they're going to run it. And I think the Shock are the better team right now. I definitely think the Eternal have a possibility of having a good weekend here. They could come up big, and they could steal this game away from the Shock. But I don't think right now that is super likely. I don't think it's going to happen right now. So I'm going to go with the Shock winning this one with a score of 3-1. Final game on Thursday is the Atlanta Reign taking on the Florida Mayhem. The Reign are a team I feel pretty good about, pretty confident in their abilities. Mayhem are getting a lot of hype right now. They're getting pretty good, scrimbucks. They're being pretty highly regarded this season, which is a bit of a surprise because it seemed like they were a team that was not going to be as good as we thought they would. They did make some kind of roster changes later on in the offseason that I think made their roster pretty significantly better. So I definitely don't think the Mayhem are going to be this easy kind of roll over and die in a ditch team. I don't think they're going to be a team that you can just, not prepare for and beat pretty easily. I think that this is going to be a somewhat one-sided affair, and I think it's going to go the way of the Atlanta Reign. I'm going to give the Mayhem a map, and I think it's going to be a 3-1 victory for the Atlanta Reign in this match. Moving on to Friday, the San Francisco Shock taking on the London Spitfire. I think this one will be a very one-sided affair. Though when these teams played last season, it was actually a pretty close 3-2 win for the Shock that looked like it was going to go the other way. I don't think that's going to happen this time. I think the Shock are way too... they're much more disciplined, I think, this season. I think the team makes more sense. I think the players understand each other more. They know each other better, so I think this is going to be a relatively one-sided series in favor of the San Francisco Shock. I think they are going to take this one 3-0. I don't think it's very close. I think the Shock are just significantly more talented. than the Spitfire are. Spitfire have the advantage of this being their first match of the season, so they've had a lot of time to prepare for it. They will have had the ability to watch the Shock the day before, but I don't think that's going to be enough for them to win this one. I think the Shock take this one 3-0. Next game on Friday is the Vancouver Titans taking on the Boston Uprising. Two teams that I think I'm relatively high on compared to other people. I think both of these teams have pretty clear spots on this roster where they look good, where they look to be a roster with strong pieces and a lot of areas on this roster I think they can improve. But ultimately, I think they have pretty talented rosters with some good players on them that I think have the potential to surprise some people. Obviously, last season, the Titans' only win of the season was against the Boston Uprising, so this is a bit of a revenge match for some of those Uprising players, though the Titans' roster is completely rebuilt at this point in time. So I think these are two teams who are relatively close together in the standings. I think it'll be a relatively close series. I am of the opinion it'll be a 3-2 match. I think the Uprising DPS are going to be an interesting thing to watch because we don't really know how Striker and Valentine will work well together. I have a lot of faith in the Titans DPS. I think it'll be a lot of a spiral and a shockwave. Those two look very good. They've been very consistent this season or in seasons past. So I think this will be a fun match. I think it'll be very close, but ultimately I think that the Uprising will edge the Titans out ever so slightly. 3-2 victory. I think it'll be a banger of a match. I think it'll be a great match. It'll be a good one, but I think it is going to go the way of the Boston Uprising when all is said and done. My first big pick game of the weekend is the Battle for Texas, the Dallas Fuel, and the Houston Outlaws. Houston managed to win the first Battle for Texas last year, but they did not manage to win any others throughout the season. Dallas Fuel are a very, very, very good roster. The Outlaws are also a good roster. I'm a little bit lower on the Outlaws than the majority of people are. I think I have a relatively non-convinced position on this team because I think that they do have some noticeable problems in terms of flexibility. They don't have a main support. They only have the one tank. Their DPS players are good, though I still have a few concerns about Dante on a roster where everybody else is Korean. I don't think this is a perfect Outlaws roster. I do think the Fuel are a very strong roster, so despite this being a big pick game that I think has the potential to be very, very close because it will be in Houston, in front of Houston fans, I think that will, in some ways, kind of elevate the Outlaws players because they're going to get to have their fans and they're going to kind of cheer them on and help them out. I don't actually think this is a series that is going to go the way of the Outlaws, and I think the Dallas Fuel take this series 3-1, knocking out the Houston Outlaws. Unfortunate for them, but I think that is the way this series is going to go in favor of the Dallas Fuel. Next, first match on Saturday, we have the Washington Justice and the Toronto Defiant. First match for both of these teams, which is a big part of why I think this match will be a, dare I say, giga-banger. I think these are two teams who are very, very close together in terms of where they are in the standings, in terms of their talent, and so this is my second big pick game for the weekend. I think this weekend is a lot of really great matches. There are a lot of games I considered putting as big picks. There are some on Sunday, there are some on Thursday, but these are the two I ultimately went with, are the Battle for Texas and the Washington versus Toronto match. I think both of these teams are very, very good. I think that you have a Defiant team that is consistent. I think they have a pretty high floor, but not a super high ceiling when compared to some of your other teams in the Western region. The Justice, I think, have a low floor, but an incredibly high ceiling. So if the Justice are at their best, if they are playing absolutely lights out, the best Overwatch that they can, I think they could be in a conversation with some of the other best teams in the league, with teams like your Gladiators, or at least in the region. So your teams like the Gladiators, the Reign, the Fuel, of potentially being that level of good, that level of dominant. My problem with the Justice, though, is that they have shown in the past inconsistencies. Now, yes, they have a new support line. Still not something that I think is amazing, but a new support line that does look good. More consistent, I think, DPS performances out of Happy as opposed to Jerry from last year. So they have made some noticeable changes that I think are beneficial to this roster, and that I think will be good for this roster, and that will make this roster ultimately stronger than they were last season. But the Defiant, I do feel very confident in. Their scrim results right now are pretty highly regarded. Their scrim bucks are pretty high. And I think the Defiant, we look at them last season, they were a team that performed very well early in the season, then kind of plateaued a bit and didn't have that same level of increase throughout the season. It's obviously a different roster now. Hisu's the only piece that's returning. But with a support line of Twilight and Chorong, and Hisu as the centerpiece of this DPS, and I think that the other parts of the DPS line are fine. Really, you just kind of need decent performances out of this team. You just need consistency. I think Muse and Hotba are the definitions of average consistency, so I think this is an interesting roster, an interesting lineup. I think first match of the season, I feel more confident in the Defiant to take this one, and so I am going to go with the Defiant taking this one 3-2 over the Justice. I think this will be a giga banger. That will be a really good match. I think this is probably my match of the weekend. I think it'll be really, really good. I could be wrong, but I think it'll be very good. Next match on Saturday is the Atlanta Reign taking on the NYXL. They played one time last season. It was in the June Joust. NYXL got rolled by the Reign. I think, of course, this NYXL roster is more competitive than what it was last season. There are a lot of concerns, of course, about visa issues this team had. A lot of questions about what their roster would have been if those visa issues were not in play. The Atlanta Reign are a pretty full roster. They're just waiting on Speedily at this point, but I think talent-wise, the Atlanta Reign are better than the NYXL pretty much across the board, especially with how good Kai has looked recently. I think this is going to be a pretty one-sided affair in favor of the Atlanta Reign. I'm going to give it to them in a 3-1 fashion, taking down the NYXL. Final match on Saturday is the LA Gladiators versus the Boston Uprising. Obviously, historically, the Boston Uprising have played well against the LA Gladiators. And the Gladiators have not played well against the Boston Uprising. So, there is that storyline. I don't think it matters, though, because these rosters are so wildly different at this point. I think the Gladiators are far too talented to have this series be close at all. And so, I am going to give this one to the Gladiators. Uprising, I'm going to give them a map for a 3-1 Gladiators victory. But I really do think the LA Gladiators are looking to be a dominant top-level team this season. And so, I am giving them the advantage here over an Uprising team that I feel is good, but not amazing or great. Moving on to Sunday, we have a rematch of the Bread Bowl from last season. We had to wait the entire season last time for Vancouver to take on London. Not this season, though. Vancouver and London taking each other on week 1. Second match for both of these teams. I think this one will be pretty close. Once again, I think both of these two teams are relatively similar in terms of where they are in the standings. But ultimately, I do think Vancouver is the stronger of the two teams. I think Vancouver is in a better position. For history's sake, I am going to give this one a 3-2 in favor of the Titans. I could see this one being a 3-1 or a 3-0. I do think there is a gap between the Titans and the Spitfire. And I know there's some people who don't agree with me because they think very highly of the Spitfire and some other pieces, but I think the Titans have done a really good job of blending rookie talent that's incoming that has shown a lot of potential, like False and Skyrippa and Psycho, who have looked good at times in contenders and have had some good moments, with some veterans who I do feel very confident in, with Aspire and Shockwave and Masa in particular. And so, to me, this is a roster that I just think looks better on paper. I have a lot more questions about London and how consistent they'll be, how well their roster will work together. Yeah, Vancouver only has one tank, and that is a concern, but I think right now they look stronger than London. I don't want to penalize London too much. Obviously, they did have to make a roster change this late, close to the season with Landon coming in. I just don't think London will be at their best right away. I think Vancouver right now is just going to look like a stronger team, and I'm going to give them the edge over the London Spitfire in a 3-2 fashion. Next, I have the Mayhem Eternal match. Another close one, I think. I think the entire day of Sunday is really good. I think all 4 matches on Sunday will be very, very good. Paris and Florida are two teams that I think are very similar in terms of their position in the rankings. Florida, more flexible. I think more high potential. Paris is a team that I loved watching last season. They were one of my favorite teams to watch last season. They were scrappy. They were underdogs pretty much every game they played. And they had some impressive performances. And I think this is an interesting match. Florida, I think, has a lot of things that they haven't really come together fully as a team yet. They're still, I think Sir Majed is just getting to Florida now, like a couple days ago, he got to Florida. So I do have some concerns with this Mayhem roster. I don't think they're going to hit a peak right away. Both of these teams have relatively high scrimbucks right now. I think Florida has the kind of potential to be a 2020 Valiant style team where they just don't look very good on paper, but really impress because of strong coaching and just strong scouting. I definitely think that is a possible direction for this Mayhem squad, but I think the Eternal right now are better. I think they are ever so slightly a stronger roster in this current moment, and so I am going to give the Eternal the edge 3-2. Definitely a close series in my opinion, but I think the Eternal take this one when all is said and done. Next is the Dallas Fuel against the Washington Justice. When these two teams played last season, every match they played against each other was a banger. They were so close together in so many instances, in so many different matches. This was one of my favorite, semi-rivalries last season. Obviously, it was Dallas-Atlanta, Atlanta Gladiators, Dallas-Shanghai. Those are the big kind of rivalries from last season. But Fuel vs. Justice was a really good one that I thought didn't get enough love for how close these two teams played last season. And I'm hoping for another match like that this weekend. I'm hoping this is kind of this season's Shock Outlaws opening weekend match where it's a long, hard-fought banger of a match. I would love it if the Justice walked away from this one with the win. Underdogs. I would love it if Happy kind of is that player who just keeps getting these underdog wins in the opening weekend. Really, I do think this is a really awesome match we're going to get between these two teams. But I am not risky enough to pick the Justice to take this one. I think the Fuel are too good. I think it'll be close. There's a potential, fatigue that the Fuel might face, having to play the Outlaws at a live event a couple days before. Definitely could have some impact on them. They're going to be traveling the next day, which, how much will that affect them? Who knows? I think they're both playing on stage, right? They're both going to be together on stage, I think. That's what they're doing. I don't know for sure. But that's definitely something to kind of keep in mind. Could potentially impact the Fuel, but I don't think it's something that'll make them lose. I think it's something that would just make it a closer series than it would have been before, but ultimately I think the Fuel are going to take this one in a 3-2 fashion. Final match of the weekend is the Houston Outlaws taking on the Toronto Defiant. I think this one will be pretty close as well. I'm very high on the Defiant. I definitely am higher on the Defiant than a lot of people are, and I'm pretty low on the Outlaws when comparing my opinion on them to a lot of other people. I don't love the Outlaws. I don't love their lack of flexibility. I think the Defiant are consistent. I think their support line is really good. And I think that ultimately is one of the big things that I'm very interested in seeing. How do the Outlaws, who don't have someone who's a strong main support player, play into a Defiant team that has a really good flex support and a really good main support? They have arguably the best support line in North America. It's arguable. I think the Gladiators has the best one. But I think if you want to just kind of have a 1-2 punch argument of what the best is, Defiant are certainly up there with Twilight and Charong. They look like one of the best. It is potentially one of the best. It is an elite level support line. Potential, at the very least, with this Defiant support line. And so I think it'll be interesting to see how they match up against the Outlaws, how the Outlaws are able to play into or around a team that is able to run a lot of those really strong support-based compositions. How does Piggy match up against Muse, or how does Piggy match up against Hoppa? I think it's going to be interesting. I think these are two teams that are very similar. They're very closely matched, in my opinion. But I do right now think the Defiant are the better roster. I have more faith in them. I think they can adapt better than the Outlaws can. To me, the Outlaws are a team that are going to be very, very stuck. They're going to be able to run 1 or 2 compositions really, really well, and that's about it. They're not going to be able to change anything because their team just does not have the flexibility to do that. On the other hand, I think the Defiant have a far more flexible, far more adaptable roster. They can adjust to changes on the fly much better. And so to me, the Defiant will take this one. It'll be close. It'll be a 3-2. But I think the Defiant ultimately walk away as the winners of the final game of the opening weekend. So here's just a quick look at my overall kind of picks. If you want to see them, you can kind of see the way it's highlighted. Teams that are bolded and underlined are the teams that I predict to win the matches. And then the italicized matches are the big pick games. So pretty good weekend, I think, of matches. I don't think there's really any major stinker. Even, the Spitfire Titans, where it's like 2 teams we don't look at as very good, I think will still be a good match. Maybe the Spitfire Shock game, but other than that one, I think it'll be a pretty good set of matches this weekend. So, that is it for the picks for this week. If you all enjoyed and are excited for this season, let me know by leaving your support in the comments down below, letting me know what things you are excited for, and letting me know if you think I got any of these picks wrong. And of course, as always, if you enjoyed this video and would like it in the future, consider liking and subscribing. But that is going to be all from me for today. Hope you're all staying safe and staying healthy. Hope you're all excited for Season 5 of the Overwatch League to kick off tomorrow. And until next time, bye-bye.